Sir. 1 2 1 2. Check 1 1 2. Hey hey. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Hey 1 1 2 1 2. Check 1 1 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Foreign mic.
Welcome to Waterway 6 at Waterway Marriott for what is a very special event where we celebrate 45 years of Apollo 17. We've celebrated the science all day, and now we hear the story behind the story. From those that were involved, from the flight director, Gerry Griffin, to the first and only geologist to walk on the moon, Jack Schmitt, and from Jim Head, who was telling Jack what to do in the back room. And still is, yes.
And still being ignored.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. That's why I'm still talking. I'm trying.
And I think that sets the tone with the way things are going. I do want to thank these gentlemen for agreeing to come and speak with us. I also want to thank Carle Pieters, to my right, who has graciously taken on the responsibility of keeping these three under control. I also want to thank NASA Livestream. We are live on the internet, so I will be watching my language. I will be speaking pure American. How about that? Y'all.
When are you going to start?
So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Carle and shut up and go sit down.
Yeah, we do have mics here that people are going to be able to ask their own questions. Right, good. Okay, all right, good. Well, I don't think any of you, well, for those of you who've been here during the whole day, you've already heard a lot of the good stories, and now you get a chance to really talk about some of the big questions that this first generation of lunar explorers can give you insight into. That's right, not the last. However, I recognize in the audience, we not only have first generation people, and there's fewer out there, we have second generation and third generation, and there are going to be more generations coming along. But while we have these key people, as Clive mentioned, the person who kept things ordered in the front room and kept mission control room in Houston, this is Houston. Our man on the surface with a rock hammer and other instruments, Jack Schmitt, and in the back room where they kept the scientists at the time. They weren't on the moon, they were in the back room. But there's a lot of planning that went into it. And that's what led up to where we are now. So I'd like to start that. I hope all of you have been thinking through the day of questions you'd like to have the opportunity to bring forward to this illustrious group of people who have extensive experience firsthand during the exploration of Apollo 17. So we can start some of the questions. What we'll do is we'll start, and each one of them will make a short presentation, discussion of some of their perspectives. Then we'll start opening it up for questions. We only have an hour, but let's go forward. Gerry.
Apollo 17 was, I mentioned this morning, was the capstone of the program. It was also a mission that was very, very failure-free. We had problems on every flight, and although we did have a little trouble getting this one launched, we were over 2 hours late getting it off because of a launch systems problem, a sequencer. By the way, that was the only hardware-caused delay, CAPE hardware, in the Apollo program. Everything else was software, or something wasn't right with the booster, or something wasn't right with the spacecraft. So they kept us up pretty late, launching it just barely December 7th of 1972 at the Cape in 11:30 at night in Texas. But it was a great mission, lots of records set, but the thing that was really poignant, I think, in the whole thing is that Apollo 17, we really focused on the science. We had gotten past, we had been out to the moon 9 times altogether and landed 5 times already. And at that point, we had a lot of confidence in the booster and the spacecraft and the people. And, well, except for one, maybe. But
That's why he quit mid-mission.
so it was kind of a perfect storm. It all came together at the right time, where the ground was focused on the science as much as the guys in the crew were, and the guys in the back room. And we had integrated it and finally pulled it all together. And it's just a shame we didn't get to fly 18, 19, and 20, because I think we would have hit on all cylinders for those other 3 flights. But it was a great experience. We'll talk about some of the fun stuff and some of the maybe not so fun stuff, but I'm glad to be here with you to talk about it.
Well, let me get down in the weeds a little bit, since you brought up the question of the sequencer.
Yeah.
You know, the real story there is something that you ought to all take to heart, and that is that the sequencer was doing what it was told to do.
Oh, yeah.
Remember?
Yeah, yeah.
What happened was that somewhere in the deep, dark past of programming, that probably, what, an IBM 360 or something like that, was told to send a signal to pressurize the S2 LOX tank and liquid oxygen tank. Second stage, and it didn't send that signal. But in the last 30 seconds, it was going through its checks, and it thought it had, and that the tank had not. It knew it hadn't, and so the tank wasn't pressurized. Well, the tank actually was pressurized, because a human being in the Launch Control Center saw the tank didn't get pressurized, and he punched a button and pressurized the tank. So we were ready to go. The computer just didn't know it. Now, the other lesson is that the way we fixed it in those days was to put a shunt around that command, a literal shunt, a wire shunt around the command, so the computer finally knew that the tank was pressurized. And that was done actually in the Launch Control Center.
Yep.
So there are several lessons in there. Just keep them to heart. And particularly now that you can't put shunts in computers, you better get the programming right from the start. And the other thing I might mention, he said we had no failures. Well, we had a failure that could have been consequential, and it was for a little while, and that is my commander put a hammer in the left-hand leg pocket of his suit. And at one point, he walked by the Lunar rover, hooked that handle on a fender, and broke it. And by breaking that fender, which was really a dust flap, and by breaking that fender, it meant that we were going to be driving with dust raining down on us all through the mission. And he got very concerned about that, as he should have been. He shouldn't have done it. But nevertheless, I kept telling him, particularly when we were back in the cabin after it happened, I said, don't worry about it. These guys are going to figure out, and tomorrow morning they'll have looked at everything we have in the cabin, and they'll come up with a fix. Well, I don't think he got any sleep that night. He was really, really concerned. And the reason I wasn't concerned, I got great sleep, was because I had spent most of my 10-year career in Mission Control Center working with these guys, and knew that exactly what they were going to do. As soon as that fender broke, I was certain that a bunch of guys got together in a side room, did exactly what I say. John Young sort of led the group, but the idea on exactly how to fix it came from probably a 22 or 23-year-old Terry.
Terry.
Well, anyway.
Had a mustache.
that disappeared a long time ago, and sure enough, the next morning they had the procedure all worked out, and what we did was take some unneeded photo maps, taped them together. You guessed it, gray duct tape. And we had some unneeded clamps for holding lights, 2 of them over each of the windows, and took those clamps, and that's what we ended up clamping on the fender on. It took 5 minutes. I thought it actually took an hour, but I was very impatient. But we got out there and put that on in 5 minutes, and then we were good to go. Cool. So those are sort of down in the weed comments. And
I was going to bring that one up, but I didn't. It wasn't even a failure. It was just it was a bypass.
Well, it's only an inconvenience, and if we'd had to dust those,
Yeah.
well,
you
anyway,
did
we had
throw
to dust them anyway.
Yeah,
but,
you did throw some dust.
Yeah, it was going. The thing is that in 1/6 gravity, you get a forward rooster tail. That's the problem. Everything was going forward instead of back without that dust flap. Jim?
Yeah, it was really good to be able to use those maps. You know, we were worried they were going to use the geological traverse maps to fix the fender, but there were some ones that were kind of the decent maps, I think, that finally made the cut.
No, they were the
which ones
backup.
Oh, the backup.
Traverse
okay.
maps.
Backup
You know,
traverse.
in
So
case
they knew
we
they were,
landed
they knew it was
somewhere.
going to be perfect, so they didn't need the backup traverse maps. Oh, the other ones, yeah. So I'd like to just point out a couple of things about Apollo 17. First of all, Jack was the first scientist on the moon and the first field geologist, PhD trained geologist.
Get closer to the mic when you say things.
Amazing. See what it's like? I'm
Jay
telling you.
Hayes.
Of course, you know, PhD trained. He got his PhD at Harvard, but you know, it was okay. Okay, he did a good job.
Those were the good days.
So I just want to say that the performance of Jack Schmitt on Apollo 17 absolutely lays to rest any question about the utilization of humans in planetary surface exploration. The guy did a fantastic job. In fact, as he was saying at the end with the heat flow probes, get the robots to deploy the equipment so he can use his brain out on the surface of the moon. When Dave Scott came back from the moon after commanding Apollo 15, he took me aside and he said, you know, it was so much fun doing the geology that when I was out on the surface on the EVAs, I was in the zone. I didn't even know I had my spacesuit on. Now, that's really remarkable. That's really remarkable. And so the point is that humans can really do things on the moon, and Apollo 17 really showed that. Not just the integration of the whole system, mission control all the way throughout the system, but also Jack's performance. So people that go to the moon in the future, that's half of you in this room, I hope. You know who you are out there. So, you know, we're just going to have that kind of performance. It's going to be great. And humans can really explore. They can do all the kind of things that Jack has done. And in fact, they're going to stick around and help interpret the data instead of going on the rubber chicken circuit or wherever astronauts used to go. So this is great. That's a good way to start. One thing I wanted to say, too, was that being in the back room was the culmination of an experience. It wasn't just like, oh, it's time for the mission, let's do it. Basically, I want to make a point. You hear a lot of things about the, oh yeah, the Apollo astronauts, they were all scripted. We don't want to do that anymore. You know what I mean? They just followed the script, got out on the surface of the moon and followed the script. In fact, it's just incredible. This is a real disservice to all of the Apollo astronauts and their performance, their incredible performance on the moon. First of all, they got general geological field training and classroom training in lunar samples and geology and petrology. Each landing site was carefully chosen, selected for fundamental scientific reasons, and the results of each previous mission were factored in to that selection. So, you know, on the one hand, we were studying the samples as they were coming back. On the next, we were actually studying the landing sites and trying to figure out what we just learned from those samples to put into the selection of the next landing site. Once the final landing site was selected, the field training, geological training, was shifted to things that were more relevant to the details of the new site. And the astronauts participated significantly in that. And once, indeed, and for each landing site, there were several specific scientific goals. That's why the things were chosen. And for each goal, there were objectives. And for each objectives, there was an implementation plan to try to accomplish that objective. This is really scientific planning. It's really important. So the geological traverses were then planned to accomplish these goals and objectives. No one who goes into the field without a plan. You have goals and objectives, and you try to accomplish them. That does not mean you follow a script, as Jack pointed out many times during the mission, okay, with his performance, okay. It means that, in fact, you have a plan, you integrate that with the field geophysics and all other kinds of things, and then you go out and explore. And exploration is really at the finest it can be in the Apollo program. So the point I want to make is that the astronauts were free to change this plan at every point on, in the traverses. What they discovered, and we've seen this on each of the J missions for sure, what they discovered and what they observed completely changed things. We were in the back room to help see what was going on, to help in contingency planning and things like that. But the bottom line is the strategy for training the astronauts, I think, from my point of view, can be summarized in what I call anyway, T3. Train them, trust them and turn them loose, okay? So by the time you get to surface operations on the moon, it's not like you're sitting there trying to tell them what to do or holding up a rock, should I take this one, etc. No, you're sitting back thinking, hoping, and knowing you've done a really good job, and they're there on the moon exploring on their own with all the people in Houston helping them if it's needed. And so what was it like in mission control, okay? We provided basically broad perspectives and overview, answer questions if needed, and time to time there were questions that they had for sure that we were able to do it. Help with contingencies like Gerry was talking about. You know, gee, you know, we just discovered this, you know, or this is really looking good, and we're thinking, okay, does that mean we should need more of this? Did we achieve that objective or not with that sample? And also, we could watch the operations and the landscape, which is beautiful, from the rover TV. And we could, in fact, we worked in the back room to reconstruct the traverses and keep track on the samples that were collected in the film mags, et cetera, and then come up with preliminary interpretations that would have an effect on what we might do on the next EVA and things like that. But what was it really like, okay? It was just amazing. It was a complete and total adrenaline rush. We'd worked with Jack and Jean for years in the field, in Houston, at the Cape before launch, when they were living at the Cape just before they launched, and at the bar from time to time. The most infamous one, which is the Cork Club. You guys probably don't even remember that, but and the thing was, we were literally with them on the moon, literally with them. We could see on the television what they were doing, where they were going, and we were discovering things as they were. It was absolutely amazing. We were thinking about how each station or sample fit into the overall strategy and the goals and objectives, and listening to the excitement in Jack and Jean's voices. That was the most important thing. I mean, you could hear them like a couple of kids up there. And when Jack came up, orange, this orange soil, my God, we went ballistic. It was just like completely amazing. And we were rushing around trying to figure out what was going on. And Jack was, in his mind, you know, developing the plan, adjusting the plan based on what he was seeing, et cetera. It was absolutely incredible. The complete awe of exploration, what it was like. And I hope that you all had the same experience as we return humans to the moon in the coming decades. Some of you will be in mission control, some of you will be on the moon, and you're going to have a hell of a good time. Thanks.
That orange soil discovery was made when we only had 30 minutes left in the very conservative walk-back constraints.
Yeah.
I think those could have been doubled, and something to think about for the future, I think. But on the other hand, if you double the walk constraints, then that means you drive more, and so you miss stations. So there's trade-offs in there. But and so that was one instance where I couldn't wait for the back room to make decisions. We went in. I got into a process of sampling that site in 30 minutes, and although there's one sample I wish I'd gotten. We basically got the samples that we needed and have needed in order to interpret the site. One other thing I might tell you about is the origin of the back room. And even when we're working on Mars, in fact, I think that the science back room is going to be very, very, even more important than it was for Apollo because of the planning activity that's going to have to go on there due to the communication delays. Now, Flight Director Griffin, I don't know whether you remember about the conversation. I think you were there, but anyway, I went over to talk to Gene Kranz. We had these support rooms for every major MOCR position, and so the Mission Control Center flight controllers all were being backed up by various engineering and operational back rooms. And so when I realized that, having started to spend some time with these guys, I suggested to Kranz that we think about having one of those for science, and he seemed to like the idea. So the fellow who really knew how to put this together, because they'd been thinking about it a long time, was Gordon Swan, and his guys, but particularly Gordon out at Flagstaff at the USGS. And so Gordon came into town, and he and Kranz sat down, and that really is when we began to organize that science back room. And just as one little sidebar on that, Gordon had the brilliant idea of providing mission control as well as themselves in the back room with a near real-time transcript of what was being said. Now, how did he do that? Well, he got 2 court recorders, hired 2 court recorders, one of them typing out the transcript, the other looking over his shoulder and typing in real words what was being said with a Vidicon camera staring at the type words as they came out, and that was being transmitted into the MOCR.
Yep.
And we did that right from Apollo 11, right from the first mission. And I don't know how useful Gerry thought that was, but within 30 seconds, you did have exactly a typed transcript of what was going on.
Yeah. Can I say one more thing about the orange soil? And you've probably forgotten this, but I graduated from Texas A&M, and my colors are maroon and white, and the rival university is that one over on Onion Creek in Austin called the University of Texas, and they're orange and white. So when he found this orange soil, I said, oh, God. You know, I'm gonna hear about that for the rest of my life.
Did it on purpose, that's what it was.
So you don't remember this, but while you
I
were
had a spray can, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, while you were asleep, I told the Capcom when we were about to get you up, actually the next morning, I said, if you, when you call them, tell them that the flight director would like to send you out today to find some maroon. And he did.
Yeah.
And he did. It's in the transcript. And you said something like, oh, God, or something. I can't remember. It was not a very a good response. But anyway, kind of a funny moment.
My best recollection about the orange soil was that, you know, Jack, it's orange. My God, it's orange. It's bright. We were just incredible because we thought that there's a big debate about whether the dark mantle was billions of years old or maybe just very recent because it did not retain craters, it mantled things, and so it was one of the major hypotheses was that it was really young. And orange, we thought, okay, that might mean sort of a, you know, a fumarole type thing, you know, and so that was just, it was just electric in mission control in the back room. And so when Jack got back, you know, the people that work with him, we would do unpack the samples. So you'd stand and, you know, unwrap the samples, et cetera. Of course, it's the orange soil. So Jack grabs me and said, we've got to unwrap the orange soil, and the press really wants it. Come, let's go, we'll go do this. So the press has got these lights and everything. It's the big moment. We're unwrapping the orange soil. And Jack, you know, unwraps the soil. It's brown.
So, but I think I recommended before we opened it up for the press that you get a light directly behind the cameras on the soil, so you get that beaded reflector, because that's what we were looking at.
But you
40-micron beads that were reflecting at 0 phase, giving you a very bright orange color.
But everybody was kind of like gaping. It's like they looked at it. This is the orange soil. It's like, and the only thing I could think of is, well, it's brown. That pretty much covers the university loop there, you know.
There you go. That's right.
Okay, well, why don't you start lining up for questions? I'll get things rolling here. Let's see, Gerry, you had mentioned that I understand you were involved with the Apollo 13, and now with Apollo 17. Not counting the fender issue, were there any things that caused you concern during the mission?
Jack.
Careful.
Well, the lunar module pilot was a little bit shaky, but no, seriously, 17 really, as I said earlier, was a very clean flight. I think the concern, every mission that we flew, we started with about 6.5 million pounds of high explosive fuel with these guys sitting on top of it, and 7.5 million pounds of thrust lifting it. That first 10.5 minutes, and particularly on the first stage and when you're down low, and then around max Q when you're at the highest pressure, dynamic pressure, you're always concerned. And it's going to happen every mission, every flight, every system. It won't make any difference. As I said, by that time we were pretty confident in most every system we had, and I felt comfortable going into the flight. I did, of the 6 landings, I did 3 of them. half of them, on the moon. And those were always a bit dicey. And it seemed to me, and I don't know how Jack would react to this, but the lunar module was kind of a delicate thing. It was not a big, boisterous vehicle that was stout. It was pretty fragile. And so I always felt a little apprehension on the landing, but it turned out that on 17, actually after 11, after the first landing, we landed always with pretty good fuel reserves. But it scared us to death on 11 because Neil ran it pretty close because he had to get over a boulder field. But we probably had a little more fuel than we thought we did. But anyway, we played it safe. So no big concerns going in. I can remember one pre-flight thought I had, this is the last one. Oh God, let's make sure we get them back. Get them up there, get the science and get them back, because we wanted to end on a high note, and we did.
Here we are.
One of the, Carly, one of the things that I sort of instantaneously became concerned about was the following. We did numerous what we call mission simulations, in which the Mission Control Center, the crew and the simulators, and particularly when we were down at the Cape, would all be integrated. And the fact is, the whole global network was integrated in these mission sims. Really fantastic things. And through the years that I was training, and since I knew all these guys back in Mission Control, I sort of became competitive to try to see what Simulation Supervisor was going to put in next, and to try to recognize it before anybody at Mission Control did. I never won that little competition because they had so much more data than we had, and all I had was the gauges. So I was spending my time in these, particularly the launch sims, concentrating on the gauge. I had a beautiful scan going. That's one thing you get when you learn to fly T-38s, is how to develop a scan, and Gerry knows that very well as well. And so I was thinking, I got the engines ignited, and that was the end of it. The panel was vibrating like this at a low frequency because of the first stage. Those 5 big F1 engines were interacting enough to give you this very heavy, low-frequency vibration. Drive your pickup truck down a set of railroad ties, and you'll get an idea of what maybe about 30 miles an hour. And so I was lying there saying, what do I do? You know, I can't help at all. Now, if we'd had a problem, that vibration would have stopped probably.
Almost immediately.
And my vibration would have started.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that was, I never even thought about the fact that I wouldn't be able to read those dials on the way up.
The Simulation Supervisor was really someone. This is the person who tried to introduce all these anomalies in the simulations.
SimSoup.
SimSoup, and it was incredible because if you didn't go through those, you might go through those on the moon.
We had one. Excuse me, Jim, but we had one for Apollo 11 in which I participated as an assistant to SimSoup, and I was working in some strange room with the simulation people, and meanwhile, this was Kranz was the flight director, and we gradually put in enough problems into the lunar module, and the crew was outside to start with, and Kranz finally said, "Get them in," and somebody. And some flight controller asked, "Well, what about the rock box?" And Kranz, in his typical way, said,
The lock box.
F the right box. And that at that point, the then director of science, who will go nameless, was participating in the sim. He was sitting in the back. He said, "What do you mean?" And this was a great big guy. Some of you know what I'm talking about.
So I had the honor of working with a SimSoup for a lot of these missions, and they needed one scientist and one engineer. So I was the astronaut on the moon, and the engineer was the second astronaut. So we would literally full up mission control. I would be the astronaut, get out, start looking around, do things, and we would have introduced a lot of faults into the system. Like I would say, "Oh, look at look at that monomic breccia over there. This is incredible. And I'd start, I'm heading over there to get a sample. And then, of course, we'd introduce oh, geez, I tripped over it. We'd introduce a soot leak. People in the suit back room would get that, and then, oh my God, we have a soot leak. And, you know, then that would set the whole thing going. And it was incredible fun because you really learn about the whole system, and it was, you know, it just was incredible to be able to participate. In fact, one of the biggest honors in my life after having done this was that the people gave me an award. They made me an honorary half astronaut.
Okay, let's take questions. Let's start it out. Please state your name. So
there we go. Yep.
okay.
Hi, I'm Dave Draper from Johnson Space Center. Thank you so much for doing this panel. It's really great to have you up here. My question is about the very different media landscape that exists now compared to the days when Apollo was active. You know, back then it was 3 networks, a handful of major papers. Now it's, you know, information everywhere. So my prediction is that when we go back to the moon, everyone is going to be able to participate. The last couple talks we saw here in the end of the session is going to be a way that that's going to happen. So my main question is, a lot has been written about the way the general public seemed to not keep their interest in the lunar program after the big first landing. Was that something that you felt was the case while it was happening, that the interest had started to wane? And do you agree that that won't happen again? Thanks for the answers.
Well, I'll take a shot. We knew it was happening. Probably not as aware of it as maybe some people that were very interested in the program that wanted to see more coverage. But we knew it was happening because we could see the absence of those people around. Now, there was a core of mainstream media, and I got to know several of them very well. And they were good. They stuck with us from start to finish. NBC, Jim Hart's, CBS, Cronkite, ABC less so. But they stuck with us and really, I think, wanted to make sure they told the story right. They really felt, I think, that they were a piece of getting this out, getting what we were doing out. But you're right. In this new world, everybody's going to see it when it happens. And I have a feeling that maybe the younger people will lock onto it and maybe make it better for the longer haul and get past that first startup, you know, exhilaration where everybody's watching. And then when it gets a little more routine, they fall off. But I don't know how you guys feel.
I would agree with that. I think the new technology is really important for this, and I think it'll be much, much better. But also, please remember that during that time, you also have to think about the context of national events. You know, we were in a war in Vietnam. The cities were burning in many cases, and you know,
3 assassinations.
And so that was another context. People were becoming distracted by other major things. But I think it's absolutely
people weren't. Media was.
Yeah.
Media was distracted.
Well,
the people were still interested in the program. They weren't getting the information. If you don't have the media covering it,
that's true,
at the same level, people don't get the information.
Well, you know, there's
nowadays, I think we're overcoming that because of a much broader spectrum of media outlets.
You know,
well, at the same time, I was doing Apollo during the day and the week, and then on the weekends I was with 100,000 of my closest friends down protesting the war. So there was some
You know, I really think Apollo, and I've used this before, but so it's not just an initial thought. I think in that very high, tense period of the war and the assassinations and school campus violence and everything going on, Apollo, when the missions happened, got pretty good coverage and people watched it. And I think it was a glimpse at something positive that they were almost reaching for. And then as soon as we landed, we never heard from the general public again till 6 months later. And so I think it's going to be different. And at the end of your question, I think it's going to be better.
Amen. Let's go on to next.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm Luke Ranieri from the University of Arizona. And as a field geologist, I've often wondered, looking at these austere photos and videos, Dr. Schmitt, was it as if you were in a truly alien landscape? Did it feel that way with the Earth hanging motionless in the black sky? Or did it feel like just a more gray version of Death Valley or the Utah desert?
No, it was a beautiful place to be, and as most of my field areas have been, and I felt like I was within a field area that I was going to enjoy and assimilate the scenes. I didn't talk about the scene very much because I was assimilating it, and at $1 million a man minute, I didn't want to waste any of that time. And those were those year dollars. You can do your own inflation. The valley we were in, as you should be aware by now, was actually deeper than the Grand Canyon, at least in part. And you had this brilliantly illuminated wall or walls of the valley, but they were in reverse silhouette against a black sky. And that's probably the hardest thing to ever get used to when you're on the moon, is the sky's black with the sun up, not blue. Now, if anybody here climbed Everest recently, well, you can get up to at those altitudes and start to see a relatively black sky, but that's not normal. And I never fully got used to that. It didn't bother me. It just I didn't get used to it. And of course, when you have anytime you feel a little bit homesick, you can look up and see the Earth, 250,000 miles away, plus or minus. But I tell you, I felt very comfortable the whole time I was there. It was I've worked in isolated parts of the Earth before, Alaska and Western Norway and places like that, and I felt as comfortable, maybe more so, because I had thousands of people looking over my shoulder, watching things that out on Duke Island in southeastern Alaska, that there was. Neil Irwin and myself, and nobody else knew what we were doing. And once a week we'd get a pontoon plane in with some supplies. It's very, very different environment. I probably felt that the risk in Alaska was far greater than the risk of being on the moon. And the same goes for being alone, climbing up the side of a fjord. You shouldn't do that. I don't recommend that.
Go to the moon instead.
Buddy,
Really.
Always work in the field with a partner, okay? But we never do because we can't afford it.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, Vince Rue, and one comment about whether or not people remember. I remember, not to date you, but I remember when I was in grade school watching the two of you on the moon.
Oh, God.
Not to date me, he
Not
just
to
did.
date you. And being fascinated by the whole thing, and the next day I had dismantled just about every single contraption in my house, to my parents' dismay, and was in the backyard building my own spaceship. I'm here now.
Good for you.
So there is that. But I'm just curious, just from a human standpoint, what was the most irritating thing during the trip?
Well, let's see. Flight director, he was sort of in the background.
The back room.
He was in the background.
Excluding people.
I could always anticipate what Gerry was telling him, telling Parker to do. Irritating. Physically, the most irritating thing were forearm muscles. Because this pressure glove at 3.7 pounds per square inch, anytime you pick something up, you're working against that PV term. And you wear these muscles out in a hurry. Now, we didn't understand physical training like the space station assembly astronauts did. And they really worked at it and got the kind of direct muscle conditioning that we should have had. But we didn't understand that 45 years ago, nearly to the degree. We worked out, but we didn't do specific training of muscles, which we should have done. And so on the second EVA, second excursion, my camera bracket came loose. And why, I don't know, because we tried. But anyway, it came loose, and I was having to hold my camera for that whole traverse out to Station 2. And my right hand forearm muscles got extremely fatigued. And that stays with you for a while, but not a lot. Once you get that fixed and everything, then you start to recover. And I think one reason you recover, and I never had any muscle soreness the next day, no muscle soreness. And I think in 1/6 gravity, your heart circulation system is just that much more efficient that you don't accumulate the toxins in your muscles. They get flushed out. So that's just something to remember. But get better shape than we were, really, for at least for those muscles. Find out what muscles you're going to need to use when you go to Mars or when you go back to the moon, and make sure those muscles are in shape and keep them in shape.
Sounds like the moon is a healthy place. We ought to have more studies on that. Okay, next one, please.
Hi, Kirby Runyon, APL. Jack, I'm wearing the pin you gave me. Thank you for that. And my question is, a lot of attention is paid to the field geology you did, but you also spent several days orbiting the moon. And I'm wondering what your impressions are geologically and, I don't know, from a human perspective of looking out the window at various lunar landscapes.
Well, I'm in the process of writing some of that up, and that's what this whole diary thing is about. And but I will tell you, there's a lot you can do as a geologist from 60 nautical miles, and particularly two things that are relevant to what we've been talking about here today. One is that once the orange ash, orange soil was discovered, that triggered in Ron Evans' mind the ability to see it. I mean, he had not seen it, but he started looking for it around our landing site, and then he saw plenty of it elsewhere, over at Scopicius Gallus and elsewhere. So Ron's mind was triggered by that discovery, and then when I got up into orbit, I built on that, and it's amazing what you could see. In fact, there's a rimless, almost certainly collapsed crater in the southern part of Serenitatis, near the rim of Serenitatis, in which I could see black, red, orange layers of ash in that crater that were exposed. The stratigraphy was very clear. You could pick it up on the prime film positives that we had in the camera. I took pictures of course. And after I came back, I was going through those images, and you could still see it. The Hasselblad, it was a Ektachrome 368. It was a new Ektachrome film. I was not really happy when I heard they were going to use Ektachrome, because in the old days, Ektachrome was a lousy film. This was a new Kodak film, and it was fantastic, and still is today. Mark Robinson and his crew have been scanning that, and the digital images are as good as I remember the positives being. And it's been kept refrigerated, of course. That was one thing. The other thing, on the far side of the moon, on one of the early orbits, I noticed that some of the large craters, almost basins, had these extremely flat floors. And they also had these rimless craters, irregular rimless craters, Mare-like craters in the floor. And that really is where I started to think about this thing we talked about a little bit earlier, of whether or not we weren't getting some pre-Mare eruptions that were actually producing these this very fine-grained lithoclastic material that I was seeing in these very flat-floored craters. So that idea has been in my mind ever since I saw these craters on the moon. We had mapped things in the geological mapping program of the survey. While I was there, we had mapped things we call Cayley, which is smooth plains material, and I hadn't really thought about whether they might be volcanic so much as we sort of thought they were base surge kind of deposits off the basin, and I suspect some of them are. But I tell you, there's a lot you can do visually on the moon if you just concentrate from orbit, if you just concentrate on it. But it helps to have some preconceived hypotheses that you're working on to look for things. And if you're not thinking about something, you probably won't see it. I might mention that in the context of Shorty, we actually had thought about Shorty Crater being so dark, even though it was dark by contrast with a light mantle that it penetrated. We had thought about, though, that it might be a volcano, a volcanic crater. Even though everything we knew about it suggested it was an impact crater, which indeed, as soon as I walked up to it, it was clearly an impact crater. But that's what puzzled me when I started to see this color in the rim, because that's one thing you see around volcanic craters. And if you go into the transcript, you'll see me playing back and forth in my mind, talking too much probably, about exactly what this was. And it really wasn't until we saw it in the laboratory and were able to really look at it microscopically. It's a little hard to see 40-micron beads with your naked eye. That we can, you could tell that, yeah, this was volcanic ash.
I just should quickly add that there's a paper by Harrison Schmitt, this guy here, and Beverly Kita, which describes those orbital observations and really documents the Supercaeosalis and the extension to the rest of the moon. So it's a really good reference. Proceedings of the Lunar Planetary Science Conference, Dum.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name's Tim Fagan. I work at Waseda University in Tokyo. This is mostly for the flight director, but all of you might want to comment. You have a technical background, but you were not trained as a geologist, but you went on field trips to do some field geology and get exposed to that. Was there anything that was specifically surprising about that experience? And is there like a strong memory that you have of that part of your work?
Actually, I do have some strong memories. And it was a hoot. That's what it was. It was so much fun. But I had Lee Silver on my left hand, and he taught me in about 3 days a lot about nearly, not nearly as much as Jack or Jim would know, but about field geology and how you went about it. And the way he did that was very interesting. Where's the site where all the kimberlite is? That I can't remember the U.S. The U.S. site. The U.S.
Oh, you mean in the Navajo Indian Reservation?
Yeah, it's Navajo.
Fort Defiance.
Yeah. Well, anyway, he wanted Dave Scott and Jim Irwin to find that kimberlite. So they just had, kind of like you said, a hypothesis of what they were going to try to go do. And I never will forget Lee. They'd start off and maybe get a little bit off in this direction. He said, "They're going to miss it. They're going to miss it." And then they turn around and they come back and say, "By golly, they're going to do it." And eventually, up this canyon, because they kept tracking something, and they found the kimberlite. And I never will forget how Lee said, "Yes, they've got it. They understand field geology." Well, in those next 3 days, I learned what a slump feature was, striations that I, as an aeronautical engineer, I had never worried about. And so when I got back to JSC, and we got into training, and then we had some sims with the guys, I knew exactly, I knew what they were doing. And then when they were out on the moon, I knew exactly when he would say something, and you guys would say something, it would trigger. And that started with 15. So 15, 16, and 17, all of the flight directors at one time or other got out on one of these field trips. And it changed our thinking.
Oh, completely.
Changed our thinking about what we were trying to do while we were on the surface of the moon. And it got us away from thinking about, okay, in 48 hours we got to lift off, and we got to think about making sure we're ready. Well, we were doing that, but that was in the back of our mind. The science was first. So it was a great experience, and I went on 2 other field trips, and with different guys, Bill Malberger, I think Jim, you were on one with me, and great experience for somebody that's going to be running something like that on the ground side. That
Buell Park Navajo Indian Reservation trip to the Kimberlites was memorable for another reason. You may recall that coming through Gallup, Gene Simmons and I stopped off at a butcher shop and bought some steaks. And when we got out to finally into camp that night, we marinated those steaks in a whiskey known as Mattingly and Moore, and they were the best steaks we ever had. And of course, some Mattingly and Moore had been consumed by that time. But they were good. They really tasted great. We had beans in an open can on the fire and things like that. I tried that same process back in Houston a few weeks later, and they were the worst steaks.
You didn't have enough to drink.
By the way, that's not the Gene Simmons many of you are thinking it is, okay? Okay, so just a quick, I think one of the things that you're seeing here is what we call the science, engineering, and operations synergism. I mean, Gerry just didn't go like, I'm really into this, I'm really thinking about it. The whole engineering and operations cadre was energized for this. He's also thinking, well, how can we improve this? They need more stay time. Look what they could do if they could do this. That's how we got 3 EBAs. We talked about 4 EBAs. That's how we got mobility. All these things were science and engineering synergism. And if we don't get that from the get-go in our future exploration of the moon, we really have not absorbed the lessons of Apollo. It's just great.
It was fun.
It was.
It was a hoot.
And it will continue to be fun. Let's move on.
Hi, this is Aditya from Team Indus. I'd like to know your views, especially with the work that you did in Apollo, so both mission control and the astronauts, as to what are the learnings, and especially from crew composition in case we were to return back to the lunar surface, and how would that work when we go to set foot on Mars?
Well, my take on that is that, and it's been proven in the space station and even in some of the space shuttle missions, that your best bet is to put the people that know the business up there, and that's a scientist, or if you're doing processing of some kind of materials that you have to do in zero-G, put somebody expert in it. At one time, I mean, let's face it, when we started the program, everybody had to be a test pilot. And then they said, well, you didn't have to be a test pilot, but you have to be a pilot. And we've proven that that's not exactly right. Certainly you got to have a pilot to pilot the craft, and you don't want that to be a first-time experience. But we've had,
You don't.
at least I don't.
No, you don't.
And but with the scientist on board to do the kinds of jobs that make sense, then that's what we ought to do. And you know, in Jack's case, he got his education at MIT and Harvard, and or Caltech and Harvard. I'm sorry. And then
he didn't learn everything,
and he wasn't smart enough so they had to send him to pilot. They had to send him to pilot training, and he got that mastered, and did very well at it, as a matter of fact. And then he got elected to the U.S. Senate and got his vocational training.
That was my
but he went through the pilot phase, because even when Jack was selected with his counterpart, scientist astronaut, NASA felt they had to go get pilot training. So I think that day's gone, and it's not needed.
Well, I'll tell you, for Apollo, it was needed.
Yeah, Apollo
it
was
not
different.
only gave me the background to begin to have confidence in engineering systems and engineers as well, but it limited comment. But it I think developed a mental discipline that really most people who are 10 years older than the normal pilot trainee we just don't have. If we've been in science, we're used to concentrating on trying to solve a problem. And I mentioned earlier developing a scan. Boy, you have to do that. And in science, you don't normally have to do that. You got to be willing to take all sorts of different variables into account, but you can do it on your own time. Yeah. In an airplane, you can't do it on your own time. You've got to keep that scan going. And that was very important. And indeed, I still would argue that the more pilot training people who go into space can have, the better they're going to perform and the better the crew will perform. Yeah. I think I still feel that's very important. I think it may have been a mistake to have de-emphasized that, but I think it's coming back now. The new astronauts are getting more time in aircraft and more chance
and they are flying
to learn that
back seat. Right.
And they're being, and I guess they're actually starting to solo in small aircraft now too.
Well, and the thing about the spaceships are going to change. one of the things is size. I mean, you know, you guys had to be able to cross-train to be able to fly.
Exactly.
And particularly in the lunar module.
Well, I was I was systems engineer and a backup pilot. So, you know, you had to have that discipline.
But the spaceships are going to get bigger. We're going to be able to have crews that, you know, that you can have some of that backup. I agree with you. I think it's more the flying gives you a culture of kind of facing risk every time you fly or whatever.
Well, that was Deke's argument. He says it was a psychological argument.
Yeah.
That we fly the simulators, and if you make a mistake, you reset and fly the simulator. You make a mistake in an airplane, you got to get out of it yourself, and it's a mental discipline that you get.
It's a mental.
This is Kun Wang from Washington University in St. Louis. You just mentioned the story of discovering the orange soil. So I was also interested when you discovered the first lunar down night, 72415. I was reading the transcript. You seemed very exciting, surprised. So can you tell us more? What's the backstory of discovering the down night? And what were you thinking? Why did you decide to bring back to the Earth?
Well, it may not sound as exciting as it was, but we had dealt with boulders 1 and 2 at Station 2, and I just might mention that at the boulder 2, I came up on it and suddenly thought there was a giant inclusion in it. And it turns out it was a spall that had been knocked off by some earlier small meteor, but because the spall had occurred, it changed it got rid of the patina that covers all these rocks, the very brown high alumina, high silica patina, and it's brown because of the nanophase iron that's encompassed in it. And so when I looked at it, it looked like this great big spall. So I started sampling it and the border of it and things like that. And I finally realized, hey, this is all the same rock. It just doesn't have the patina on it. So I wasted some time there with that. And after we had then obtained the rake sample, I believe already, we headed back to the rover. And I was literally running downhill and noticed this blue-gray breccia as I was going by it that had this very obvious large inclusion in it. And so I skidded to a stop, literally skidded to a stop. This was about a 20-degree slope I was going down, and went back up to it and looked at it real carefully. And initially, if you look at the transcript, I said it looks like a rhyolite. Well, and that's what it looked like, because it was a cataclastic dunite, but it had some large crystals in it. It was bimodal for some reason. It had large olivine crystals in it, and so it looked like there were phenocrysts in a fine-grained rhyolite, which is something you see often here on Earth. And and as I got closer and closer to it, I said, well, gee, it's greenish. It may be olivine. It may be a dunite. So I finally got it right. But that's what you do in the field. You never, very often, your first observation is not your right observation. But you can't erase your notes. In fact, you never should. In a notebook, you can cross it out, but don't erase it because it may be important later. But when you're doing a transcript, it's sort of stream of consciousness, and if you're going to take notes, you got to take notes, and don't hold back. Really, don't worry about being wrong. And that's another reason we should add that the professionals, whatever field they're in, test piloting, geology, physician, if you're really a professional, you can't worry about saying something that's wrong.
Right.
But
You've got to have confidence in yourself.
Jack, you did notice that rock was special right from the start.
Exactly.
And that was a key.
It was different, and that's what geologists are always looking for.
Justin Cowart, Stony Brook University. I've done a lot of field work, and it's often difficult to keep on task. Your field excursions, for lack of a better word, were pretty heavily scripted in what you were trying to do. How do you mentally prepare yourself to stay on task and take into account new discoveries that you're finding along the way, such as the orange soil or some of the glass that you were finding in the bottom of these small impacts?
Well, in fact, they weren't scripted. We had a plan. We had stations we were going to go to, And we had certain types of samples that we would want to get at certain places. And that turned out to be a pretty good plan. We revised it as things went on. But other than that, the way we organized ourselves was that I would get off the rover and start doing local reconnaissance. Unfortunately, Gene was left with the task of dusting the various radiators and things like that. Thermal radiators.
It's the commander does that.
Yeah,
Commander
and I was perfectly happy with that delegation of tasks, and may have influenced it to some degree. But the job I had was to try to see, now we're here, take Shorty Crater. I immediately went up towards the rim of the crater. There's a big boulder up on the rim of the crater that, because of the size of the crater, 80 meters, I guess, in diameter, that might be a fairly good sample of a deeper portion of the basalt in the valley, the so-called subfloor basalt. And we hadn't gotten to Camelot Crater yet, where we really got some interesting basalt samples. And at that time, we thought we were going to get deep samples. I no longer believe that. But and so I was headed there, and as I walked up to the rim of the crater, geologists keep their heads down, and that's why sometimes we get neck problems, I guess. But I was looking, and clearly the color had changed. The regolith surface had changed. It had taken on a yellow tint. And if you also look at the transcripts, you'll see that I hesitated. Why did about it being something special? Why did I hesitate? Is because a little while earlier, I had tried to sample a reflection off the rover that was orange. Coincidentally, there was mylar on the orange mylar on the rover, and it was reflecting on the surface, and I went over and started to sample that. And so I was hesitant about this orange because and I said, you'll see in the transcript, I said, "Where's the rover?" Because I didn't want to be embarrassed myself again about sampling the orange. And so it's just a process of continually looking, evaluating, having your multiple working hypotheses, and hopefully being able to notice those things that do not fit a particular hypothesis or any hypothesis. And it's just something that in field geology, hopefully a professional field geologist will learn to do over time, and eliminate what's important, what's not important, and concentrate on what's important.
Jesse Tarnas, Brown University. This is a question for all three of you. So people talk about using the moon as an intermediate step to train the astronauts and the teams that support them for future Mars missions. Did you guys feel that after Apollo 17, the team could have tackled a Mars mission if the money and technology had been there? Did you feel that the Apollo 17 team could have tackled a Mars mission without going to the moon, with just the previous Apollo missions having been there? Or would you have wanted multiple trips to the moon for the team to feel prepared for a Mars mission, assuming the technology and money were there?
It's hard for me to separate what I think now with what I might have thought then. What I know, knowing what I know now, and having co-chaired a Mars human landing workshop back in the early days of the Constellation program, with Rob Manning actually at JPL, I realize now that Mars ain't going to be easy. No. And particularly the transit to Mars, but from an operational point of view, entry, descent, and landing, EDL, is going to be tough. You have just enough atmosphere to cause problems, not enough to help you, as I've said so many times. Yeah. And there are a whole bunch of operational issues related to not only landing on Mars, but working on Mars that we really need to work out closer to Earth. And the moon's a place to do that. And there are many things you can do that. Now, let me just pick one operational issue. I frankly don't think, in the final analysis, that a crew will go to Mars and abort to come home. Mm-hmm. I just don't think you do that. The cost, the time, and everything. So you need to engineer your landing craft, entry, descent, and landing crafts, so that you can abort to land and work out the problems there. It just makes, to me, it's just common sense that you would not do that. And that's a challenge. And I think we can work those kind of operational issues out at the moon, and should work them out at the moon, partly in a simulation mode, before, and figure out what are we missing operationally that we didn't think of with respect to preparing for Mars. The nice thing about the moon is you can work on most of these kind of issues out, communication delays, things like that, while you're doing good science. So you get a double return from it in preparation for Mars. Now that's based on probably a lot more thinking than I ever had after Apollo 17.
I would just add to that I think all the other Apollo astronauts I've talked to about this issue, all of them say that we're not going to go straight to Mars. We need to go to the moon to learn how to do it again, and also to train the astronauts. That's going to be their training ground for going to Mars. That's what a lot of people say.
Well, it's also a multi-generational training program, because one of the things I keep saying that whatever agency gets the responsibility of deep space exploration, if it's an indefinite responsibility, you're going to have to train multiple generations. And you have to stay young. The agency has to stay young. Apollo was young primarily because it was a 10-year project.
Right.
Had it been a 20-year project, I don't know. You would have probably.
Well, I was going to say I'm biased. I'm like you. Back at the time, I thought we could do it. The operations team was up and ready to do it, but we knew there was some technical issues, radiation shielding being one of the biggest, that nobody had a handle on it. I really think, and now I'm biased, we got to go back to the moon for a lot of reasons, but we got to get our mojo back. Deep space is different than low Earth orbit, and it's hard to get. It's almost as hard to get into low Earth orbit. A lot of energy, but deep space operating out even at 240,000 miles or so was different.
It's different.
It's different. And operating as far as Mars, now you're going to have to have a different kind of ground support system. They got to be a lot more autonomous on board, and the ground can help with the longer term issues and that sort of thing. But I think we got to go back to the moon. At least, I know NASA's got this Gateway project that I guess most of you have heard about by now, where it would be an orbiting vehicle that could be used for a lot of purposes. And it might have, what they're talking about right now is maybe having some remote control unmanned probes down to the surface that would be, but that's not it. We got to get some people down there and get back to doing it.
Make sure you don't get distracted here.
Yeah.
Another thing, let me give you another issue, and that is that when you take a spacecraft to Mars that you're going to land, it needs to be your simulator as well, because you have to stay trained. And and I've always sort of thought maybe you should plan on having not only 2 vehicles to land, but 2 crews. So again, think in terms of the cost and time and effort required to get to Mars, and you don't land.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why this talk of a Phobos mission and things like that. However interesting it might be to some people, I'm thinking of the geopolitical and the psychological, whole political side of things. Yeah. You need to, when you go to Mars, you need to go to Mars.
Amen.
Okay.
Thank you.
I like that.
Okay.
I just want to add one quick thing, because I think it's really important for all the young people in this room. So I've seen hundreds and hundreds of very, very bad space movies, and when I saw Apollo 13, I thought, oh my God, they pretty much got it right on that one. So I said, Jack, have you seen Apollo 13? He said, that was the most realistic a thing about what portrayal of what it was like to be in mission control, et cetera. It's Jack. He said, hey, there was just one problem. And I said, what was it? He said, don't you remember? All the people in mission control were too old in the movie.
Yeah.
He said, don't you remember? What was the average age? Like 20?
Well, 26.
26.
Jimmy,
that was
Kranz's estimate.
Yeah. But it was even a little bit younger than Gemini.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, they've been there for years.
Yeah.
So we're talking about all these old people, okay, but look.
Do you want to know
mid-20s,
why
mid-20s.
they were older? Did I tell you?
No.
Okay, here we are. Clive?
Oh, wait a minute. I've got to tell him.
Oh,
it's
okay.
because Ron Howard, the director of Apollo 13, had a brother who was 40 years old. His brother wanted to be in the movie.
Had to be in the movie. Okay.
And so you couldn't have a 40-year-old surrounded by 22-year-olds. And so that's why everybody in Mission Control looked as old as Gerry and I look now.
Thanks for leaving me out of that one.
Yeah. Clive, believe it or not, you get the last word.
I get the last word. Well, there's a thing. My last word is to wrap things up. I don't have a question for these guys. Well, we'll talk later. But I do want to thank everybody for coming. I especially want to thank Carle for herding the cats, and especially the three gentlemen that you see up there representing the tip of the iceberg of the Apollo program in terms of what it achieved. 45 years ago since the last humans walked on the surface of the moon. I think Jack and Gerry have said it, and Jim said it, we got to go back. Hopefully we can get there. That it's not going to be with the guys up there. You're going to learn from their experience. It's not going to be from me, even though I'm only 47. Yeah, see, I got some people thinking, didn't it? I also want to thank Aditya came up from Team Indus and asked a question. Team Indus have sponsored the goodies that you have down at their booth. You can pick them up tomorrow during the poster session. Just drop by their booth. Interestingly, we've got quite a number of different commercial companies at this conference. We have Blue Origin represented by AC Sharanya, who's very interested in what we're talking about. Stand up, AC, please. Thank you, AC. Yep. Also, thank you, Team Indus. Aditya, where are you? There we go. Thank you very much. And do we have anybody from Moon Express here? You popped in. Because they are sponsoring the League networking session where the young people can talk to the 47-year-olds, but can talk to those who are not so young. But it's a way to network, ask questions, figure out the next career move, get advice, just network. And if I catch a lot of greybeards huddling together and talking, I'm going to go break them up. All right. But again, Gerry, Jack, Jim, Carle, thank you very much for this. 45 years since Apollo 17. What a rush. It's been fantastic to hear you speak. It's been fantastic to hear your recollections. It's been a great day of science. And now let's go back to the moon. Thank you very much.
That was so terrific. Oh.